Hi friends, it's me, Rich. If you went on the Svelte Summit website this week and looked at the speakers, you would have seen my face in a box that said TBD secret, which makes this talk sound way more exciting than it actually is. It sounds like there's going to be a big reveal or something, and sadly there isn't. I would say you should blame Kevin for over-egging the pudding, but the reality is it's all my fault. I was just too disorganized to send him some actual information. So no big reveal. I'm just going to yammer on for 20 minutes or so about an app that we've been working on for the last week. The context for this is that I work at Vercel, and last week was Vercel Ship Week, in which we launched a whole bunch of new products. I'm not going to recap them because you can just watch the keynote online. If you do, you might notice a familiar face in the background. They let me be an extra for the day. I got makeup done and everything. Vercel production values are kind of nuts. Anyway, among other things, we launched integrated storage products. With a couple of clicks, you can add a Postgres database and blob storage to your products, which is really neat. One of the things that I do at Vercel is I try out new products that are in development to make sure that they work really well with SvelteKit. So I thought it would be fun to try and build a photo sharing app which would use Postgres and blob storage. It would also be an opportunity to work on one SvelteKit feature in particular that I've wanted for ages, which has been in our issue tracker since October 2021. That feature is something called shallow routing, and it gives you a really nice way to tie state to history without causing navigation to occur. Finally, I wanted to try and build something with Tailwind. I've always thought Tailwind had some really persuasive arguments about the right way to do CSS, but I've always looked at Tailwind code with absolute revulsion. And I wanted to challenge myself to get over the hump and see if it started to make any sense. And my verdict is, I actually really like it. There are some things that I don't love. It gets very repetitive, and the solutions for avoiding that repetitiveness kind of undo a lot of the niceness. And there are some fundamental limitations with the Tailwind approach that means it cannot solve all your CSS problems and probably never will, and we'll talk about those later. But on the whole, I was pleasantly surprised. So here's the app. It's called SvelteSnaps, and you can access it yourself by going to sveltesnaps.vercel.app. I'm going to give you a tour of this app and show you how each bit is implemented. The first thing we obviously need to do is log in, and if we use the inspector, then we can find the component that lets us do that. It's this login.svelte component, which is really just a very simple form. When you click on it, it posts to the login action of the auth page. So let's open that. And you can see that it has these login and logout actions there. We're using Discord to do our authentication. When you post to this action, it will construct a URL with this is the base and with all of these bits. Note that we have some state here, which is just a random UUID that is attached to the browser as a cookie, and it's also attached to the URL that we use for authentication as a query parameter. And then we just redirect to that URL. And so when we do that, it's going to send me to the Discord login page. And it's logged me in already. The way that it did that was by redirecting me back to the redirect URI that I specified, which is this auth callback route. So if we visit that, you'll see that what it's doing is it's first checking that the state in the cookie and the state in the that it was passed match each other. And then we swap the code that we got back for an access token. Then we swap the access token for a user using these functions down here. And then once we've got that user information, we put it into our Vercel Postgres database using just raw SQL. I know some of you are looking at this and being like, Rich, why are you not using a type-safe query builder? Can I be real for a minute? They all suck. Even the really good ones suck. Every time I've tried to use something like Prisma or whatever, I've come back to raw SQL, like, please forgive me, I missed you. Just write SQL and use type coercion. It's totally fine. So we add this user data to our database, and then we create a session which is going to give us a unique ID that we then attach to our cookies like so. And then we just redirect back to the home page. So you could use an auth library for this kind of stuff if you wanted, but I think it's pretty cool that we can just do this very easily without libraries. After logging in, I can see a bunch of photos, but you can't because you haven't posted any and you're not following anyone. I haven't added a what's hot page or a search function or anything like that because then I would need to think about moderation and this would no longer be fun. So it will only show you images and photos from people that you've followed. So let's upload something. Down here in the right, we have an upload button. And if we inspect the component, we can see how it works. So this is inside a form which posts to the post action of the root. And the input that we click on has an onChange handler, which gets the current file and then calls this push state function. And push state is a new function that exists in a branch of SvelteKit that I have running locally. And what it means is create a new history entry with this state, this show uploader true, associated with it. And so if we select a file, in fact, let's first take a screenshot so that we have something to select. I'm just going to screenshot this code. And then I'll upload that file that we just created. And you'll see this modal pops up. And that's because up here, we're showing the modal when page.state.showUploader is true. If I'm on mobile and a modal pops up that I want to dismiss, I'll often do it with like the swipe back gesture, which has the effect of going back through the history stack. But often the modal isn't actually associated with a history entry. So what happens instead is I get kicked out to the previous history entry, which, often means I get kicked out of my in-app browser back to Twitter or whatever. It's a really sucky experience. So it's important that this modal here is associated with history. And here it is. Before this new feature, this was super hard to get right with SvelteKit, maybe even impossible, but now it's extremely easy. So here's the pull request for this feature. We're hoping to land this very soon. So inside this modal, I can add a description and hit enter, and it'll create my new photo. But this wouldn't be a SvelteKit demo app if we didn't take progressive enhancement really seriously. So if you don't have JavaScript for whatever reason, then you're not going to get this modal. So what can we do? Well, let's disable JavaScript here. Let's go down to there, disable JavaScript, and reload the page. So the solution I came up with is this. We make the input type equals file required, and then we can use CSS to show this upload button down here when the input is valid. Right, let me show you how that looks. So we'll click the button, add an image, and this upload button appears. Now, in order to do that, we need to use a pretty funky CSS selector. I could be wrong, but I don't think this is achievable in Tailwind, because Tailwind is all about styling elements in isolation, and a lot of the most interesting CSS challenges involve thinking about the relationships between elements. This is the same mistake that a lot of CSS and JS solutions make, in my experience. So Tailwind gets you 90% of the way there, but it's not enough. You still need to be able to associate real CSS with your components, and Svelte scope styles are obviously where it's at. So when we click that button, we run our post action. Let's bring that up. Right, it's going to read our file data and then use the Vercel blob API to store it, giving us back a permanent URL. And we're getting the width and height by reading the raw image data using a fork of a package called image size. And we're storing that in the database so that we can avoid layout shift when we render the photo. Now, because the description of a photo is required when you submit the photo through JavaScript, we know inside this action that if there is no description, like this, that we can't publish it yet, that we came from a Node.js submission, and so we need to go to this, this publish route, which you can see on the right here. And so now I can add a description, hit enter, and we're now on the photo page. Now, hopefully it goes without saying that this works without JavaScript. I can toggle the light button, I can add a comment, I can delete the comment, and all of this just works without any real effort on the part of the developer because I'm just using SvelteKit form actions. Of course, most of the time I do have JavaScript enabled, which means that we can do optimistic UI. So I'm going to re-enable JavaScript and reload the page. So now when I toggle this button, we get instantaneous feedback. Let's look at how that's implemented. Again, we'll just open the component using the inspector so that we can find the form. So what we're doing here is we're grabbing a list of the accounts that have liked the photo as well as the current user account from our data object. And if I click on go to definition, then I can see where this is being defined. It's in the page server.js next to the component. And we can see the SQL that generated this query. So when I toggle this, I don't really need to go back to the server. I can just update it in place. And if the action doesn't succeed, then I just revert the data. Now this code might look really suspicious to you. We're just mutating the data object. Like, can you do that? Isn't it super sketchy to just mutate stuff? Maybe, I don't know. I, Rich Harris, inventor of Svelte, hereby give you permission to mutate your data. The only condition is that you should mutate it to look like what it would have looked like had it come from the server. You can get much fancier with optimistic UI, but you can get a long way by just toggling stuff. Now, if we look at the deployed version of this image, we'll see that it's coming from this _Vercel/image endpoint. And that's happening because the image is using this optimize function. And optimize is just replacing the URL with /_Vercel/image. This is a Vercel feature called image optimization, which lets us serve smaller versions of images based on the user's browser and screen size. So we upload full-size PNGs and JPEGs, but we get back compressed WebP and AVIF files. To enable image optimization, I've currently got this script which runs after each build, but I think we're probably going to just add this to the Vercel adapter in the near future. Let's go to my profile page. It's got my Discord username and avatar because we grabbed those when I logged in. Apparently Discord is changing how usernames work soon, so I don't know if this will work in future, but like it works today, so whatever. This page gets its data from an API route, which executes this monster SQL query. I did not write this. ChatGPT wrote this. A nice thing about just using SQL is that ChatGPT is really good at writing SQL. Now you might wonder why we're using an API route instead of just running that query inside our load function. Well, that will make sense in a minute. Remember, in SvelteKit, when you see a fetch like this, which is using the fetch that was passed into the load function, we're not actually making a network call. It's calling your API route directly like a function, so there's no overhead. Okay, so the first thing you'll notice on this page is that all the photos are a bit wonky. And this is deliberate. I wanted this app to feel a little bit rough and homemade, so the photos are kind of irregular, as if they've been laid out on a surface. And we use a handwritten font and a bunch of icons that I'm proud to say I drew myself. You might think it looks lame, and that's fine, but I would rather look lame than look the same as everything else. I find a lot of modern web design utterly charmless. Everything is so sterile and homogeneous. Everyone's using the same design systems and color palettes. So even though I'm not much of a designer, I really enjoy the feeling of carving something unique. And I was pleasantly surprised to discover that Tailwind didn't get in my way, which I thought it probably would. Okay, so how do we make the wonkiness work? Let's open up our photo list component and take a look. Now we can't just use math.random because true randomness rarely looks good, and because we want consistency between server and client renders. So if we look here, we're actually just alternating between even and odd. And the fact that the photos are different aspect ratios means that we get a decent amount of visual variety. So it kind of works. This page implements infinite scroll, which means two things. Firstly, we're only showing a subset of photos at any one moment. And here in DevTools, we can see these data item ID elements. There are only two in the DOM right now. And as we scroll, photos will get added and removed depending on what should currently be visible. In order to demonstrate the effect, we're literally only showing photos as they become visible. Normally, you would have a bit of a buffer on either side. This is all happening in this scroller component, which has this handle scroll function, which is updating the window every time we scroll and adding padding to the top and bottom of the element to compensate for the items that are being removed. You'll notice that the images fade in as they load, and that's happening because every image has this smooth load action which sets the opacity to 1 when the image is loaded. But you'll notice that because we've stored the width and the height of each image in the database, we don't get layout shift as these images load. So we've talked about windowing, but the other thing our scroller needs to do is tell us when to load more data. It does that by dispatching a more event when it detects that we're getting close to the bottom of the scroller. And the parent component, our photo list component, is listening for that more event, and when it hears it, it loads data from the same API route that we use to populate the initial data on the page, but we're adding this start query parameter which tells it to skip the first however many photos. In turn, the photo list component emits its own event to tell the page that some data has been loaded. And here's that event handler. Now, again, we're mutating the data object, which might feel a little bit naughty, but I find it to be a pretty effective technique. And of course, hopefully it goes without saying that all of this works without JavaScript. If we just disable it, reload the page, then instead of getting infinite scroll, we get pagination. I've turned JavaScript back on so that we can talk about another use of the new push state feature. You might have seen this pattern on other websites like Instagram. If you interact with something in a long list, it's kind of nice if you can open it on the same page like this instead of losing your context. So how does this work? Well, on each A element, we have an on-click handler here. And the first thing we do is we bail out if the meta key is pressed, because that means that the photo is being opened in a new tab. We also bail out if the window is small enough, because we only really want this to happen on larger screens. If neither of those conditions is met, then we prevent the event default because we don't want SvelteKit to route to this page. After that, we need to load the data that we're about to display. Now, we could have written this app in such a way that we didn't need any additional data. We could just use the list item instead to populate the contents of this modal. But as it happens, the photo page has a list of comments, whereas the list page just has numbers of comments. So we do need to load some additional data. Now, we could use another API route and then fetch the data, and that would be fine, but we'd be losing out on one of SvelteKit's neat features, which is preloading. Let me pull up the network tab so that I can show you what I mean. When you hover over a link, SvelteKit's default behavior is to load the code and the data for that route in anticipation of you clicking on the link. We can see that in the network tab here. If I hover over this photo, it will load some data from the server so that it can navigate to that page, like that _ data.json file. Now, it would be pretty cool if we could use that same mechanism even though we're not using SvelteKit's router. And that's what this preload data call does. Preload data already exists in SvelteKit. Here are the docs. But today, all it does is sort of prime the pump so that when you do navigate, the data is all ready. But here, it's actually returning the data for the page. And because we're already hovering on the link, we can access data that the router was preloading anyway, which means that when we do click it, the modal pops up instantly without any more network activity. On mobile, there's obviously no such thing as hovering, but we can start preloading on touchdown instead of waiting for a click. So you still get a nice speed boost. So if everything goes well, we just call push state with the resulting data and we pop up this modal. Similarly to before, we're just showing the modal inside an if block where page.state.selected is the page data that we previously loaded. And this photo page component is literally just the page.svelte component that we would have rendered if we had navigated to this page in a new tab. So we're being efficient about reusing code. If we wanted to, we could load the photo page component lazily, but for simplicity's sake, I'm not bothering with that here. Now you'll notice that my push state call up here has a second argument this time, the original link href. And as a result, the URL bar has updated to the photo page, even though I didn't navigate there. That means that I can share this URL And if I reload the page, it'll take me to the right place. So I'm pretty excited about this feature. It is super easy to use, but I also have a ton of flexibility as to how I use it. Right now I'm on Conduitor's page, and if I scroll down far enough that it loads some more data from the API route and then click to my feed page, it will load some new data. But watch what happens now when I go back. Not only does it maintain my previous scroll position, but it's also using the data that was previously in memory, not the initial data that comes from the server. Now, how can that be? The answer is that we're using a relatively new feature called snapshots. When we navigate away from this page, we run this capture function. And then if we return back to it, like so, we run the restore function with the previously captured values. So we're actually just replacing the initial data with this stuff that we had lying around in memory and resetting the scroller to its previous scroll position. This is the sort of thing that you would normally need a very elaborate client-side state management system to pull off. And the fact that we can do it with a pretty small amount of code honestly feels like cheating. Now, there are some limitations. For example, we're still loading the initial data from the server, even though we immediately discard it. It would be nice if we had a way to prevent that. There is an open issue for that here, which you can comment on if this is a feature that would be interesting to you. Another problem is that data can get stale if you're not careful. For example, if I pop up this modal here and add a comment, then by the time I close the modal, I want the comment count to be updated. And at this point, you might think that we need a really convoluted state management system, but we really don't. We just need this very simple store. This is all the code that's required to keep things in sync. And we just update it with data from the server whenever we get it. This is all pretty hacky, and I'm sure you'll find creative ways to break it, but it's a lot of fun to explore the limits of this stuff. At the moment, it feels like every framework is scared of running JavaScript in the browser and is retreating to the server, but I think it's a mistake. If we can update our UIs without always deferring to the server and without over-engineered state management, then we should. All right, that's my time. I had an absolute blast building this app. The sad truth about being a framework maintainer is that you're often looking at problems in a slightly abstract or isolated way. So it's really helpful to sharpen your knives on real world problems from time to time. And I hope we get more chances to do this sort of thing. I hope this was useful to you and you picked up some new ideas or SvelteKit tricks. If you have thoughts on the new APIs and how you'd like to see them evolve, then GitHub is waiting for you. Thanks for watching.